Arts, Quarter 1, Module 2, Western Classical Art Traditions, Part 3. Representative artworks and artists from Byzantine, Romanesque, and Gothic periods. The Barberini Diptych, Louvre Museum. It represents the Emperor Justinian I as triumphant victor, which consisted of 5 ivory plaques fitted together.
An emperor on horseback in the central panel with 4 panels on the 4 sides, one of which is lost.
What's remarkable to me is just how deeply carved and how energized the central panel is. And there's been tremendous care in representing not only fine details, but also alternations between areas of deep carving and broad, smooth areas, for instance, of the horse's body. This is so clearly an illustration of this moment of transition between the classical tradition and the Byzantine as we will come to know it.
Mosaic of an Asian queen with dark eyes and hair with fierce expression.
Guess who this is? You've seen her. You've heard about her. This is the Empress Theodora. As you can see the different color tiles to make up her jewelry.
Hagia Sophia, Holy Wisdom in Istanbul, Turkey, designed by Isidore of Miletus and Anthemius of Tralles in 537 BC. Structure has ashlar brick and mortar joints and is of masonry construction, which is one of the biggest domes ever created and constructed originally as a church but transformed into a mosque.
The best look at ancient Constantinople is a church-turned-mosque that's been considered among the greatest houses of worship in both the Christian and Muslim worlds. Hagia Sophia, the great church of Constantinople. Built by the Byzantine Emperor Justinian in the early 6th century on the grandest scale possible, it was later converted into a mosque by the conquering Ottomans. Today, it's a museum. Hagia Sophia, which marks the high point of Byzantine architecture, is the pinnacle of that society's 6th century glory days. This church was completed in 537, just about when Europe was entering its Dark Ages. For 4 centuries after that, Christians in Europe looked to Constantinople as the leading city in Christendom, and this was its leading church. This clever dome-upon-dome construction was the biggest dome anywhere until the Cathedral of Florence was finished during the Renaissance 900 years later. The vast interior gives the impression of a golden, weightless shell, gracefully disguising the massive overhead load supported by masterful Byzantine engineering. 40 arched windows shed a soft light on the interior, showing off the church's original marble and glittering mosaics. But the Byzantine Empire collapsed in the 15th century, and Hagia Sophia was turned into a mosque. Christian mosaics were plastered over, and new religious symbols replaced the old. This church was built to face Jerusalem. Mosques face Mecca. When Hagia Sophia became a mosque, they couldn't move the church, but they could move the focal point of the praying. Notice how the prayer niche is just a little bit off center. That's because it faces Mecca.
Christ in Majesty, circa 1123 by an artist named Master of Saul, located in Barcelona. Spanish fresco transferred into a canvas in which Christ is depicted in full frontal view with the Gospels in his left and his right hand blessing the viewers, and was surrounded by the mandorla or almond-shaped frame. Last Judgement, carved by Gislibertus before 1135 in Cathedral of Saint Lazare in Autun, France. Displayed in the tympanum covered with plaster, and its center Christ is enthroned in a gloriole held by angels.
Medieval mind.
We're looking up at the doorway of the Cathedral of Autun, which represents, I think, the most terrifying image of the Last Judgment, of the damned in hell that exists in art history.
Of course, it also includes heaven, but I think people were probably spending much more time looking and fearing hell. This is a sculpture that is one of the first monumental sculptures.
The Norman Crypt of Worcester Cathedral. rebuilt by Alexander Mason between 1224 and 1269, and finished by John Clive from 1360. Grand sculpted portals in the doorways of Worcester Cathedral. Lady and the Unicorn Tapestry, 1506 to 1513. Series of 6 tapestries created in the style of Thousand Flowers, often considered as one of the greatest works of art of the Middle Ages in Europe.
Its centerpiece is a 15th century series of tapestries called The Lady and the Unicorn. In medieval lore, unicorns were solitary creatures that could only be tamed by a virgin. In secular society, they symbolized how a man was drawn to his lady love. In religion, the unicorn was a symbol of Christ. These exquisite tapestries were inspired by both secular and religious traditions. They give us a peek at life, sensual life, from a time when the people of Paris were just stepping out of medieval darkness. It's a celebration of all the senses. Taste. A woman takes candy from a servant's dish to feed it to her parakeet, while a little dog licks his lovingly woven chops. Hearing. An elegant woman plays sweetly on an organ, calming an audience of wild beasts. In this fanciful world, humans and their fellow creatures live in harmony in an enchanted garden. Sight. The unicorn cuddles up and looks at himself in the lady's mirror, pleased with what he sees. The lion turns away and snickers. As the Renaissance dawns, vanity is a less than deadly sin. Touch. That's the most basic and dangerous of the senses. Here, the lady strokes the unicorn's horn. and the lion looks out at us to be sure we get the double entendre. Medieval Europeans were celebrating the wonders of love and the pleasures of sex. The words on Our Lady's tent read, "To my soul desire." What is her only desire? Is it jewelry? Or is she putting away the necklace and renouncing material things? Is it God? Love? The unicorn and lion open the tent. Is she stepping out or going in to meet the object of her desire? Human sensuality is awakening. The Dark Age is ending. And the Renaissance is emerging.
Rose window from the north transept, designed by Jean de Chelles and Pierre de Montreal in 1260. Stained glass windows created to transform the vast stone interiors with warm and glowing color.
If you've ever visited a cathedral, you might have noticed a dramatic circular stained glass window dominating one of the walls. This type of window is called a rose window or a wheel window. Both names refer to the fact that it's made of a series of smaller windows radiating out from the center like wheel spokes or flower petals. Rose windows are usually found in two locations in a church, at the west end of the nave, or the main body of the church, and at the ends of the transepts, the shorter sections of a church's floor plan that give it the shape of a shallow cross. The rose window developed out of the oculus, a small round window found in ancient Roman architecture, but it was during the mid-12th century and the development of Gothic architecture in France that rose windows came into prominence. Later they spread to many places in Europe, notably Spain and England.
The Shepherd David, 13th century. Gothic manuscript illustration which shows some realistic detail and naive naturalism. Pulpit of Pisa Cathedral, sculpted between 1301 and 1310 by Giovanni Pisano. One of the most iconographically dense works of art in the history of art in Italy, crowded with figures from the Old and New Testament.
This is one of them. This is the pulpit from the Church of Sant'Andrea in Pistoia, which is dated to 1301. This is by Giovanni Pisano, and you can see the structure is essentially the same. There's colored marble columns with capitals, allegorical figures on top of the capitals, below reliefs that make up the low walls of the pulpit itself. One difference you can see right away is that the corners that separate the reliefs are no longer small columns, but rather figures. And what this does is give a greater sense of continuity and connection between the individual reliefs, as opposed to them being very distinctly separated by the frames that we saw in his father's example from 40 years before.
Right, where there were attached columns there. Right?
Right. And I want to look at one specific thing in this pulpit, which is the relief that we see here on top of the Massacre of the Innocents. This tells a story from the New Testament where Herod orders that all the newly born male children in Bethlehem be executed because he's heard that Christ has been born and this new leader that's going to bring great changes that he doesn't want, according to the text. And so he orders this execution, and what we are looking at here is this really emotional, disturbing scene of Roman soldiers slaughtering children and their mothers trying to, as we see here, protect them or mourning over their dead bodies. We see averting their eyes, running away, soldiers with knives in their hands, actually executing infants, the women covering their faces. Here's Herod giving the order. Now, in some ways, Giovanni Pisano's sculpture is connected to that of his father. There's this naturalism that we saw developing earlier on. There's classicism, especially in some of the other areas of the pulpit. But what makes Giovanni Pisano's sculpture of the early 1300s more distinct is obviously his great interest in communicating emotions, a kind of vibrant, expressionistic representation of the feelings, and this that communicates the horrifying scene that we're looking at. It really connects with the viewer and helps.
Their gestures, their facial expressions.
Exactly, those are the keys for him and other artists throughout this period, using gestures and facial expressions to tell a story as powerfully as possible.
And of course, this is another sign of moving away from the Middle Ages, from those Gothic
Exactly.
Expressionless faces.
Especially in terms of marrying that kind of those kinds of expressions, that kind of emotion, with naturalism.
Right.
Because sometimes in Gothic art you do see things that are, you know, very graphic or violent looking, but also very stylized. And here we have a kind of naturalistic representation that's naturalistic in terms of the physical appearance, and also naturalistic in terms of the psychological expressiveness. And what's interesting...
Cathedral of Chartres, or Notre Dame Cathedral. The first high Gothic cathedral with thousands of sculpted figures and splendid stained glass windows.
Looking at Notre Dame de Chartres, which is one of the great medieval cathedrals, but it's got a complicated history. This site was a sacred space. According to legend, there was a druidic temple here. We don't know if it's true, of course, but we do know is that there probably was a Roman temple here, and ultimately it was converted into a Christian space, maybe 3rd century. At that point, we actually have some historical record, and by the time we get to around 1000, we know that there was a substantial church.
A church that was always associated with the Virgin Mary, and in the 9th century, the church received a special gift by way of Constantinople, a relic of the tunic